This is on knowledge, labor, and work in the Bible with Rabbi David Silber. This class is part of Drisha's Winter Zman 2024. In these next two sessions, we will explore the Torah's treatment of the notion of knowledge, dat, and its evaluation of human engagement in various forms of labor and work. What do these terms mean in the Torah? Is work seen as an ideal engagement or a concession to realities? Would the Torah want us to see a world without work? It's always a pleasure to have Rabbi Silber, the dean and founder of Risha, teaching. And with that, I'm going to hand things off to him for the next hour or so.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, the topic of work is a tremendous topic. It's a gigantic topic, and we have two sessions. I'm going to deal with it in general terms, kind of a general sense of at least what the text that I've chosen to look at, which are three. Today it will be from three chapters from Breshit. I'll get to that in a minute, and to raise some of the issues about work. I will say that from an economic standpoint, if you talk to an economist about work, unemployment, the economists tend to look at everything from a financial, economic standpoint. For example, in terms of, as recently, Boeing aircraft has had a lot of setbacks, financial setbacks, and their stock was trading at a relatively low price. And the last couple of weeks, the stock went up in value. Why did the stock go up in value? Because Boeing laid off a lot of people. And from the investor's standpoint, that's a good thing, because laying off people means that the company can be more streamlined in terms of cost, have a better profit. So the economists tend to look at things from an economic standpoint. But I think if we think about it more broadly, we can actually ask a lot of questions whether laying off a bunch of people overall is a positive move, a negative move. I mean, it's a complicated question, actually. But just to, what we will be looking at today is just a couple of texts, one main story in the book of Breshit. I just wanted to just introduce it by pointing out that, I mean, work is something that is obviously central to our lives, simply in terms of the time we invest in it. If you work an 8-hour day, they only has 24 hours, and a good part of the day we are sleeping. So about half of our waking time, minimally, is at work, for those who are working, and work are narrowly defined. If we think of work in other capacities, it's even more so. As far as the Torah is concerned, if we think about the beginning of the Chumash, so in the first chapter of the Torah speaks about God creating a world. The world is created in 6 days, God rests on the seventh. And what's interesting is that in discussing this transcendent God who creates in chapter 1 of the Torah, when the Torah wraps it all up, on the seventh day, God is not working. And in the language of the Torah, familiar to many, if not all of us, the Torah says that on day number 7, Vayichu hashamayim v'aretz b'chol tzva'am, the heavens and the earth were finished, all of their array. Vayichal Elohim bayom hashviyi melachto asher asa, vayishbot b'kol bayom hashvi b'kol melachto asher asa, vayivarech Elohim bayom hashviyi vayikadesh oto kivo shevat b'kol melachto asher bara Elohim laso. So in these verses, we speak of the Sabbath, the Holy Shabbat, which God blesses and sanctifies. But there's a word that appears 3 times. And the word is melachto, God's melacha, God's work. So God is working. We wouldn't have necessarily described what the creation as work, but that's precisely how the Torah does describe it. 3 times that God has rested, as it were, mikol melachto asher asa. God is working. And if we think about this description of God working, and then God resting on the 7th day, and God sanctifying the 7th day, we immediately think of a section of the Torah that directly relates to, or is based upon perhaps, the creation narratives of Genesis, which is the building of the Mishkan. If we have time tomorrow, we'll turn our attention to that. There, the Torah speaks about work. And there, I think the Torah presents us with a kind of idealized picture of what work should be, perhaps what work could be, but certainly what work should be, namely the building of the tabernacle, the building of the Mishkan, the language of which is drawn from the first two stories of the Torah, the two creation stories of the Torah. And I would add to this that in addition to describing God as working in the first chapter of the Torah, when you get to the second creation narrative, the story of the Garden of Eden, there the Torah speaks not about God creating everything, heaven and earth, but a particular place which God will inhabit. And the hope, the idea is that the human being may also inhabit the same space. We and God share a space. That was the hope. Doesn't exactly work out that way, but that's another story. But God, we are told in the second chapter of the Torah, in the second creation story, took this human being and placed the human being in this garden. Let me find the verse over here, which I'll read to you by way of introduction to our topic. Yes, it's the chapter number 2, verse number, I'll just read it to you, verse 15. Vayikach Hashem Elokim et Adam. So God took Adam, let's call it the earthling. God took the earthling. Vayanicheyu began Eden li'avda u'lishamra. And God placed the earthling in the Garden of Eden. For what purpose? Li'avda u'lishamra. To till it and to tend it. To work it and to watch it or to guard it. So the human being in this ideal world, the Garden of Eden, has a job, is not sitting idle in the garden, but rather the earthling has a job which has two jobs. One is to work the earth, li'avda, and the other is l'shamra, to protect or to guard it. That actually, I think, can move us to some very interesting observations about the world in which we live and our responsibility towards the earth. The human being is here to preserve or to watch or to guard the earth, but also to work the earth. So the human being, in the beginning of the story of the Garden of Eden, the human has a task, and one of the tasks is li'avda. And in fact, after the sin, that first sin of the humans, the punishments are meted out, and the punishment meted out to the man is that because of you, the earth shall be cursed on your account. You will eat it, bisavon, with pain, toil or pain. Etzev is pain, sadness, all the days of your life. And at the end of this section, the God addresses the human being. By the sweat of your brow, you eat your bread. You'll be sustained through the sweat of your brow, and you shall return to the earth in which you were formed. Now, the point is that at the center of the story, you have about the obligation we have dealt with Shamra on one hand, and then B'zeyat apecha tochal lechem. You'll eat by the sweat of you. You'll toil to survive. You work hard to survive. Now, I don't believe that toiling to survive is necessarily prescriptive. You must suffer when you're working. That's not the intention of the Chumash, certainly. But what it does point to is that sometimes it's very difficult to eke out a living in this world. And I would say that for many people, we talk about work, and I assume most of us, if not all of us here, are living in some Western country. And most of us are not worrying where the next meal is coming from. Most of us are pretty sure that tonight or this afternoon, evening, there'll be food on the table. That's not true of a lot of people. It probably is true that if many, if not most of the people in the world, they're working for one reason. Namely, because if they don't work, they don't eat. If they don't eat, they don't live. And I think that's a very important point to remember when we talk about work. and it's in our broader society, we're not all in one place, obviously, but in general, I think most of the people who studied at Drisha over the many years are people that are not worried about where the next meal is coming from. But one reason to work is simply without work, you can't live. That's the bottom line, basically. It's not that it has to be that way. The Torah is describing, and I would say the same thing is true of what God says to the woman about you will give birth with great pain. There's no mitzvah to have pain when you're giving birth, but it is descriptive of many situations. In any event, I just wanted to put this on the table for starters, that we talk about work, the value of work, etc. That they're sort of, in a way, two different messages, both of which are true, which emerge from the first few chapters of the Torah. Work is something that God does, which means one can see it as not just a creative act, but maybe even a sacred act. There's something important about work, something significant about work, and that the human was put in the garden, li'avdah u'shamra. By the same token, there's the other side of it. You will have to work, says the Torah. Often it's true that for many people, perhaps most of humanity, certainly over the years, it's necessary to work. So I just want to come back to my brief introduction, which is that the economists look at work purely from a financial standpoint, work, economy, etc. But I think when you look at the stories of the Torah, which deal with work, and there are many of them, the Torah raises a whole bunch of other issues which are very important, and I think which are relevant to the question of what would a world look like without work? Why is work important? Those kinds of questions. Those are big questions. In terms of the stories I'd like to look at, if we have time in these 2 days, there are 2 stories in the book of Breshit which deal very centrally with work. And then there, of course, is the second book of the Torah, the book of Sefer Shemot, which begins with work, which ends with work. And in particular, it ends on the glorious note of the building of the tabernacle, the building of the Mishkan, which is work. It is constructed by the people, but the people participate. It's called melacha, the same word that's used to describe God's creative activity in the first story of the Torah, is the same word the Torah uses to describe the people's creative activity in building a space which God can inhabit and the people can be deeply connected to, can visit, can work there, and be deeply connected to it. The 2 stories in Genesis, of course, are first of all the story of Yaakov in the house of Lavan, where he works. Torah spends a lot of time on that story. Yaakov working for Lavan, the kind of work he does, and his relationship to his employer, the nature of the work, etc. That's one story. But the story I want to look at this afternoon is the other story of the one who works, and works in several different capacities. And it just turns out that these stories are being read in the synagogue this past Shabbat, next Shabbat, etc. That's the story of Joseph, the story of Yosef. And Yosef has 4 different jobs. He starts off as a shepherd. That's in chapter 37. He's a shepherd together with his brothers, although we discover quite quickly, reading the story, that he seems not to be working with his brothers. The brothers go to shepherd the flock, and Joseph is home. Father sends him to meet up with his brothers, maybe to make peace, and Joseph ends up in Egypt. And then he has a second job. When he comes to Egypt, he works for Potiphar. We'll start with that in a couple of minutes. And then he ends up in jail, and he works in jail quite successfully. And then from jail to Pharaoh, where he works for Paro. I really want to focus on that story, working for Paro. And the issues that it raises and the questions that it raises, that's the plan. But today I think we'll start with Joseph. Before I begin, does anybody have any comments at this point? or questions for that matter?
Nothing in chat so far.
Okay, so we will just jump into our story. Story of Joseph. I want to make one point about the story of Joseph. Let's start with chapter 39. Read it last week. We could spend years on these stories. We're not going to do that. We're just looking at it from the standpoint of work. Here we come to a very important point, and this is a point that the Gemara, which I didn't give any sources from the Gemara, there are a million sources here, but the Talmud raises an issue. I mean, the truth is the Torah raises the issue, but the Talmud focuses in on this issue. And if we have a chance to go to the Jacob story, we'll see it there in spades. It's very central. But here's the point. Chapter 39 is Joseph has been sold. His brothers sit down, they decide first to kill him. And then Judah says, we shouldn't kill our brother, there's no profit in it. Let's sell him. We'll sell him as a slave. We'll get rid of him. We don't like him, we'll get rid of him. Well, we won't be killing him. Leave him in the pit, he will die in the pit. In the desert, there's no water, he'll die. And yes, we will be killing him. Not directly, indirectly, but that's the same thing, says Judah. But meanwhile, as they're talking, a bunch of traders come along. They had seen traders in the distance, Ishmaelites. Then it's very unclear in the Torah who actually sold them. It sounds like the brothers never actually sell them. Some other people come along, the Midianites, and they pull him out of the pit and they sell him to the Ishmaelites. And from there, Joseph is in Egypt. It doesn't matter for our purposes how he got there, but he's in Mitzrayim. For Yosef, who read Mitzrayim, chapter 39. Vayikneu Potifar, Saris Paro, Sarah Tabachim, Ish Mitzri, Miyada Ishmaelim, Asher Hobridu Shama. So Joseph was brought down to Egypt by the Ishmaelites. He's purchased by Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the chief butcher. It's unclear in the story whether he butchers animals or butchers human beings. He is a man who has in his basement a very significant jail in his house, a private jail. I mean, private, it's connected to Paro, but it's a holding pen for prisoners, some of whom are very high political prisoners. And that's where Joseph ends up. Now, here's the first point I wanted to make about Joseph working in chapter 39, and he will be a very successful worker. The first point is that Joseph begins as a slave. And an issue that is very significant, one wants to study how the Jewish tradition, starting with the Chumash, but especially the Talmud and rabbinic sources in general, see work. The question that is raised by the Torah raised the question, but it's so the Gemara raises it in spades, which is, what is the difference between a slave and a worker? We tend to distinguish them. They're very different. But are they that different? In other words, if you are working in Nepal, maybe chopping a stone 14 hours a day, and whatever it is, I mean, and you're doing that to get some meager money to survive, and you have no choice but to do this, are you a worker or are you a slave? I mean, what is the difference between these two? So the Talmud is very interested in this question. And this is actually a very, very interesting discussion. But I simply want to point it out that Joseph begins as a slave. Slave means you have no choice. You have no choice whether to work or not. And you also have no choice, generally speaking, what kind of work you do. You are assigned the work. In the case of Joseph, he's not just a slave, he's a foreign slave. And we know that, without getting into the details of it, Mitzrayim is a place which doesn't necessarily welcome the stranger. Right? Remember, you were strangers in the land of Egypt, the Torah said, don't mistreat the stranger. So Joseph starts, I would say, on the bottom. He's the absolute bottom of the food chain. He is a foreign slave, brought forcibly down to Egypt by the Ishmaelites who trade him. They trade a lot of things. They're traders. That's what they do. And Joseph is there. And now we have a description of Joseph in the house of Potiphar. Chapter 39, verse number 2. Vayihi Hashem et Yosef, vayihi ish matzliach, vayihi beveit Adonav HaMitzri. Second verse. Joseph, God was with Joseph. Joseph was successful. Joseph stayed in the house of the Egyptian master. Now, what's interesting is, let's take one more verse. Vayara Adonai ki Hashem ito, v'chol asher hu oseh Hashem matzliach biyado. So we have these two verses. Joseph is, in the words of the Torah, matzliach, successful. What's interesting here is, first of all, there's something which is very interesting, which from this verse you can't possibly see it, because you only can see it from the larger context. And that is, the Torah says that God is with Joseph, and the name that's used is Hashem, Yud-Hey Vav-Hey. That's the name of God, Hashem, the personal name of God. God takes a personal interest. Hashem is with Joseph. What's very striking is that the Torah, beginning in the book of Genesis, beginning in what chapter maybe 35, is that the last time the Torah ever mentions this name of God. For the last close to 20 chapters of the book, the name of God, Hashem, is never mentioned. And suddenly, in fact, God is barely mentioned at all in the last parts of Genesis. But suddenly over here, not just is God mentioned, but this personal God. God has taken a personal interest in Joseph, right? Hashem et Yosef, to the degree that his master, Potiphar, the chief butcher, can see the hand of God. God is mentioned 3 times. So this is the one of the points. God has an interest in helping Joseph. And what's interesting is the Torah doesn't actually tell us in this sequence of the foreign slave who rises to great position within the house of Potiphar. The Torah never actually tells us what he does. He's very successful, but what actually is he doing? What is the job that he's doing? It's very unclear. It's very unclear what he's doing. Torah never says what he's doing. And but God is with him, and Joseph is moving up in the world, right? Because in the next verse it says, "Vayimtza Yosef chen be'einav vayisharet oto." Joseph finds favor in the eyes of Potiphar, vayisharet oto, so he serves him. He's a misharet. Yoshua ben Nun is Moses misharet, his personal attendant. He's not just a slave. There's a personal relationship that's been set up with Potiphar. And he appoints him over his house. He now has an administrative position. He's in charge of the house. He starts as a Hebrew slave. He's a personal valet. He's in charge of the house. All that he owns, he puts into his hands. He has a lot of discretionary ability, power. And the next verse, the blessing of God accrues not just to the house, but the house and the field. So apparently, Joseph not only is in charge of the house, the field as well. And then Vayazov kol shelo b'yad Yosef, he abandoned everything into Joseph's hand. Lo yodai to ma'uma, he knew nothing of what Joseph does, save for the bread that he would eat. Vayhi Yosef yifei Torah v'yifei mareh. You have here 5-6 verses, which describe this unbelievable rise to power of someone who's absolutely on the bottom rung, the foreign slave, and suddenly he's in charge of everything, in charge of the house, in charge of the field. The master has no idea what he does. He abandons everything into Joseph's hand. And we, the reader, have no idea what he actually is doing, because the Torah never tells us what he does in this story over here. We know one thing, that God is with him. Now, what that means, what is the relevance for our topic here? There is relevance. And the point is, and this is very central to the understanding of the book in general, but what is very clear is that, and the use of the name Hashem, which is very striking, is that God has a plan. In other words, the point is, God wants Joseph, God is helping Joseph at every turn. we don't necessarily know why yet. What it's very clear is, and this is so obvious that even Potiphar sees this, and Potiphar says, listen, everything this guy touches turns to gold. So let me give him real discretionary power. And Vayazov Kol Shelo Biyad Yosef. This is the success. And now, at the end, for the end of verse number 6, Vahi Yosef Yefei Toar Vifei Mareh. Joseph was very well built, they translate, or beautiful, Yefei Toar, Vifei Mareh, and handsome. Truth is, Yefei Toar and Yefei Mareh, that description, for the most part, are descriptions of women throughout the throughout the Torah. Rachel is Yefat Toar, Sarah's the very good-looking women. Yefei Toar, right? Yefei Toar, Vifei Mareh is the Torah's description of Rachel. So the point over here is that there's going to be an interesting reversal. Typically in the Genesis, it's the woman who's at risk because the men see her and want to grab her. In the story of Joseph, it's the opposite, where Joseph is now going to be the object of the woman. In the very next verse, that Mrs. Potiphar sees him and she says, sleep with me. That's verse number 7. The point, of course, is that over here, among other things, in terms of work, depending where you work, how you're seen, etc., there is a price that one pays for success. And that's what I want to focus on, among other things, in this time we have together. In this particular case, it's interesting that Mrs. Potiphar sees him, right? Because Joseph is very beautiful. But the Torah could have told us that in verse number 1. The Torah doesn't say that in verse number 1. He's beautiful, and more than beautiful, he becomes visible only after he's moved up in the world, only after Potiphar has abandoned everything to Joseph's hand, and suddenly he's noticed. Suddenly Mrs. Potiphar notices him and says, sleep with me. She sees him. And the next story, of course, and we're familiar with the story, Joseph refuses. Joseph says no. Not only does he say no, he actually gives the reason. He explains why. He says, listen, he says to her in the verse number 8 and 9, your husband, my master, he says, doesn't know what I do. By that he means he trusts me. He trusts me completely. He's given me total freedom. He doesn't know what's going on in the house. She's probably thinking to herself, that's exactly right. He has no clue what's going on in the house. But for Joseph says, guy trusts me. I don't want to break a trust. I can't break a trust. That's not right. And not only that, he says, I'm so important, says Joseph. There's no one greater than me in the house. He's given me everything except for you. In other words, I have to show gratitude. This is a man, I came with nothing. And he has, for whatever reason, advanced me at every turn. Look where I am today. I came as a nobody. Look how important I am. I have to be grateful. Getting involved with you would demonstrate great ingratitude. You're the one thing that he says don't touch. The lechem, the wife, the personal things. And then he adds, how could I do this wicked thing? It will be a sin against God. So he adds perhaps another reason. He says, not only is this wrong, but it's also, in my way of seeing the world, this is a sin against God. This is unethical behavior, which is another reason. We could expand more upon that another time. But the point is that he's saying no, saying it, I think, in a nice way. He's explaining. He's not just saying no. He says, I can't do this. Now, of course, saying a no for these reasons suggests that she doesn't care about these things, which of course is true. But I mean, it's actually it says a lot about Joseph. It's one of the big turning points for Joseph. But here I want to make another point, and that it's a point about the story here, and it's also a point about the workplace. The workplaces or many workplaces, I can't speak for all, but workplaces are not neutral. In other words, societies, workplaces, institutions have this set of values. Now, very often those values are not, in fact, articulated. In fact, sometimes the quite opposite things are articulated. But people on the inside often have a sense of what the place is actually about. In the story over here, we have to remember we're not studying Chumash now, but we are studying Chumash. And that is that Joseph is in Mitzrayim. He's in Mitzrayim. And we remember the story of Egypt in chapter 12 of this book, that when Abraham goes down to Egypt with Sarah, he says to her, listen, we're going to a place and they see you, they're going to want to take you. You're a beautiful woman. And when they see you, they're going to take you and they're going to kill me. So do me a favor, please. Say you are my sister. That's chapter 12. Without getting to the details, is that right? Is it wrong? Should he have gone or not? But the point is, what typifies Mitzrayim in this book, in chapter 12, is seeing and taking. So over here in the story, when Mrs. Potiphar says to Joseph, sleep with me, she sees him, because he's important now. She sees him. He's your fate Torah. And when Joseph says no, Joseph's saying something very profound over here, which is, I have a different set of values. I'm not going to buy into your values. You're an Egyptian. You are Mrs. Egyptian, Mrs. Potiphar, Ish Mitzri. And I'm not. I'm Jacob's son. I have a different way to see the world. I'm not going to, yes, I function in Mitzrayim. I'm successful in Mitzrayim. I'm doing very well for myself. I bring God's blessing to everything Potiphar owns. I'm a great investment. That's all true. And I'm grateful for it. And I respect it and grateful for it. But this is my red line. This is not my values. I can't buy into this. So I think actually something to think about in terms of work. Again, whether it's work that we choose to do, or whether it's work, for a lot of people, they have no choice. Maybe they have only one job offer, or in most of the world, maybe they got to make sure there's food on the table, and they're working at some job, and they do it because they have to. Joseph came to Mitzrayim. He didn't choose to go there. He's an Eved. Now, he's so talented. He takes advantage of the situation. God is assisting him. But for the Chumash, though, the workplace is not just a neutral place. The workplace is a place where values, one's own values, have to be understood, and you try to implement your own set of values. And it's not always so simple, because in this case in particular, he's very successful, and no one is ever more successful. Joseph says about himself, he's not shy in talking about himself, by the way. Look how important I am. And she's probably nodding her head. That's right, you are important. Of course, that's why I want you. Because you're so important. And my husband abandoned everything into your hand, so you've replaced him. I'm really important. And you know what? He has no clue what's going on here. And she's nodding her head. He has no idea exactly. But it would be wrong. I mean, she takes this as taunting and teasing. But from the Chumash's standpoint, there may be an element of that. But fundamentally, the basic point is that this workplace, this society has a certain set of values, and Joseph is not going to, this is his line, Joseph is not going to accept those values, even as he is working in this society. And here, I emphasize this over here, because this is true in the house of Mrs. Potiphar. And Joseph ends up in jail because of this. Joseph, in a few verses, ends up in jail. Well, once again, God assists him. Once again, he's very successful. I do want to say one word about Joseph in jail, and I'll stop and take comments or questions. Then I want to get to the main story about Joseph that I want to talk about, which raises all kinds of interesting problems, which is my goal is to raise the problems, to raise the issues as through the study of the Chumash. But what's interesting is that Mrs. Potiphar goes back to her husband. We know the story. She propositions him every day. He refuses. One day he comes to an empty house to do his work, it says, Lasot Melachto, later in the chapter. No one is around. And she grabs him again, and he runs out. He leaves his coat in her hand, and he runs outside. And then she claims that he tried to attack her, and she says this to the other workers in the house, and then to the husband. and Joseph is put in jail. That's later on in the chapter 39. Potiphar gets very angry, and he puts him in jail in verse number 20. In verse number 20 of this chapter, Joseph finds himself in jail, right? And what's interesting is actually that, as a side point, why does he put him in jail? Now, when the man has a jail in his house, actually, he has a jail in the basement. I mean, you would think that Potiphar would not put him in jail. He would simply execute him. I mean, the man is making advances on his wife, and he says explicitly, except for the bread that I eat. The personal stuff, don't get involved, right? Joseph said, he's given me everything except for you. So why does, and the man is the Sar HaTabachim, he's the butcher. The man has a jail in his basement. Maybe butcher means not just animals, maybe he's an executioner. And Joseph, why does he put him in jail? Where Joseph is very successful. And I think the answer is very clear. If you remember the story, in the next chapter, I'll just mention, I'm sure you remember it, two people come to the jail, the chief baker and the chief butler of Pharaoh. That's in chapter 40. And then it says, when these two big shots come to jail, Potiphar assigns Joseph to them. It's interesting. In the end of 39, it's the chief jailer who Joseph is connected to. But in chapter 40, Potiphar reappears. When these two big guys come to jail, he assigns Joseph by Yesharet, the same job he had with Potiphar, personal valet, personal attendant. In other words, from Potiphar's standpoint, Joseph is still useful. He's useful to Potiphar, and he uses him in chapter 40. He understands Joseph's abilities, and he's going to use them. There's something about business sometimes which can be very, one might say, ruthless, or certainly very, in other words, the business has one issue, basically. Not all businesses, but often big business is simply results-oriented. Personal behaviors, things like that, they're important, but the bottom line is what's important. So he doesn't kill him, not necessarily because he doesn't trust his wife, which is certainly a possibility, but because at the end of the day, Joseph has utility. As long as Joseph has utility, he's going to be okay. Now, he's going to be in jail. He can't work in the house anymore where his wife is, so you ship him downstairs. You know, downstairs in the jail, he's fine because the wife doesn't go to the jail. And Joseph can be very important for Potiphar still. That's how it seems to be working over here. There's something about it which is very interesting, and I've seen this in my life. I'm not in business, but I've seen this. Certain businesses, it's just the bottom line orientation. And that's where Joseph finds himself. And the question is, can you maintain your own moral standing? Do you even recognize the problem? We saw that in Potiphar's house, he recognizes the problem. He has his limits. He says, I can't buy into this culture. I do work here, grateful and all that. I can't buy into the culture. And now we come to the story that I really wanted to look at, which I think raises all kinds of interesting questions about work, about the nature of work, the meaning of work, who we work for, etc.
Does it actually say that the jail's in his house?
Yes, it does.
And but you're intimating the idea of behavior toward humans, not just animals, like butchering or whatever.
Oh, he's a butcher. I mean, a butcher can mean he butchers animals. You have the baker, you have the butler, and you have the butcher.
Okay.
All three of them are food-oriented, right? What I'm saying is a sarhat tabochim, which boach means to slaughter. So it's possible that he slaughters animals. But by the way, even if he just slaughters animals, slaughtering is not something this guy's won't do. And in fact, we know that the jail is a holding pen for Pharaoh. Joseph, interpreting the dreams, he tells them 3 days from now, Pharaoh's going to have a birthday party. And at the birthday party, he's going to raise up the head of one of you, and he's going to chop off the head of the other guy. I mean, at most birthday parties, you know what I mean? We don't execute anybody. The point is, Pharaoh decides at his birthday party In other words, there's something over here with the story, right? Joseph says in 3 days he's going to lift your head off to the baker. The point is that
And he uses the same phrase.
same phrase, exactly the same language. Right? It's very striking, actually. You saw it, Roshecha. So anyway, my point about the Potiphar story is that it's a very good. Joseph gets training. He's running a big estate. This guy is not a regular, simple businessman. He's a man with a jail in his house. He has fields. He has sadeh. People work. She talks to the workers in the house, and Joseph also meets politicians in jail. So Joseph, when he comes to Pharaoh, he's extremely talented to start with, but he also has had very good experience. Now, Joseph, part of the Joseph narrative is interesting because on one hand, he's a slave, he's in jail, but all of these places actually turn out to be learning opportunities for Joseph. He knows what it means to run a big operation. He recognizes some of the people in Pharaoh's court. So when he comes to Pharaoh in chapter 41, he has a lot of knowledge about many things. And of course, we know that from the very beginning, he's quite brilliant. I mean, Jacob was not wrong about Joseph. He may be wrong in favoring him publicly, but he's not wrong about Joseph. He's a great interpreter of dreams. And here's the point I wanted to make about Joseph for our purposes of work, which is this. In chapter 41, Pharaoh has bad dreams. He has bad dreams. And he doesn't understand the dreams. I'm not going to get into that now. We'll take up all that time. But he has 2 dreams, 2 similar dreams. One is that he dreams of lean cows and healthy cows, the lean cows devouring the healthy cows. He talks about sheaves or stalks, healthy stalks, unhealthy stalks, and the unhealthy stalks devour the healthy ones. He speaks to his wise men, he speaks to his magicians. None can interpret them for Pharaoh. And then his butler, who was restored to his job, and Joseph had told him that Pharaoh was going to restore you. Please remember me unto Pharaoh. And the butler forgets it. But now the butler remembers. You know, when I was in jail, there was a Jew, a Hebrew slave, an Eved Ivri, a young Jew slave. And he was good. He interpreted my dream. He interpreted the dream of the other guy. And everything he said was true. I was restored to my post. The other guy was actually executed. Just by the way, it's interesting that he mentions the interpretation of the other guy, not just his own interpretation. I was restored to my post, but the other guy was hanged. Because the other guy being hanged is demonstration that this kid really knows what he's talking about. Because to say that you're going to survive, there's no downside to that. Because if you survive, you survive. If you didn't survive, you're dead anyway. You can't reciprocate. But what if I told you you're gonna die and you live? That's not going to sit well with you. And for these 3 days, I said, oh, he's going to be right. I was suffering for 3 days, and then turns out it didn't happen. So he might be very unhappy with the fortune teller Joseph. But no, what Joseph said was true. It says, so these are very talented. So Pharaoh rushes Joseph out of jail. Joseph leaves jail. He shaves, he changes his garments, and he stands before Pharaoh. In other words, this is a very important point, which has all kinds of interesting implications. He shaves. The assumption is that the Egyptians in the court have shaved. In other words, for Joseph to appear before Pharaoh, he has to dress like an Egyptian. He can't appear as Joseph the Jew. He appears as Joseph the Egyptian. And Pharaoh tells him his dreams, and Joseph interprets the dreams. And in interpreting the dreams, Joseph says to Pharaoh in chapter 41, and this is verse number 20, was it 15? I can't see it. 30, was it? I think it's verse 13. No, 33 must be. 33. Verse 33. It says, now Pharaoh should choose a wise person and place them and set him over the land of Egypt. And let Pharaoh take steps to appoint overseers over the land. organize the land during the 7 years of plenty. There's going to be 7 years of plenty. Says Joseph, you have to take all the food during the 7 years and place it under your control. That's in verse number 35. Control the food. Tachat yad paro, ochel be'arim v'shamaru. Gather the food into cities and guard it. And then he continues that this food will be a pikodon, a guarantee, a reserve during the 7 years of famine, and the land will not perish in the famine. That's what Joseph says to Pharaoh. Now, one could ask the question, what kind of chutzpah is for this kid to tell Pharaoh what to do? That's a question while we study Chumash in depth and focus on the Chumash, we deal with that question, because I think Joseph sees that as part of the interpretation. In any event, that's what he says to Pharaoh. You have to find somebody who knows how to implement the plan. What is the plan? Let's understand the plan. The plan is that during the years of plenty, you gather all the excess food. It's going to be tremendous excess. And you place it, you take it, you co-opt it. You take it for yourself and you guard it. In other words, the net effect will be that when the years of famine come, there'll be food to save the country. That's the idea, right? But there also will be food to save the country that only you control. You will have all the food. That's what Joseph says to Pharaoh. You will have a monopoly on the food. If you have a monopoly on the food, what will happen? You will be able to charge any price you want. That's the idea of a monopoly. And that's exactly what happens. What is the story in the Chumash? What actually happens in the Chumash? What happens in the Chumash is in chapter 47. The people go to Joseph in chapter 47, and they say to Joseph, right? Joseph is the one in charge of handing out the food. So the people come to Joseph in chapter 47, and the Torah says that there's no money left. They told my kesef. Says after 1 year, I'm not going to figure out the years now, but it says after a year, there's no money. And they go to Joseph in chapter 47, and what do they say? They say to Joseph, we have no money. Chapter 47, verse number 15. Vayitol makesef, me'eretz Mitzrayim u'me'eretz Canaan, vayavo kol Mitzrayim el Yosef le'mar havu lanu lechem. Give us bread. Lama namus negdecha, ki yofes kasef. We will die. Please give us food. We have no money, but we're going to die. And Joseph says to them, havu biknechem. Give me your cattle. Give me the animals. Like, you have no money, okay. You have no money, but you have animals, right? So we'll trade. You pay with the animals, and I'll give you the food. And they give all the animals to Joseph, right? Right. In that year, what happens the next year? No more animals, no more money, no more animals. So they go to Joseph. We have no more money. We have no more animals, right? That's what they say in verse number 16. But he told Mashrahi, next year, we can't hide from you. We have no money, we have no animals, we have only ourselves and our land. What does Joseph say? Why should we die? Why should we die? Take us as slaves to Pharaoh. That's what the people say. And Joseph buys their land. Right? Joseph buys their land. And in verse number 20, the paro, so Pharaoh owns all the land. Those 3 words. Now, the people, right? He moves the people around. The land of the priests they can keep. And the people say to Joseph at the end of the chapter, you have enabled us to live. That's Joseph working for Pharaoh. Pharaoh is the boss. Joseph works for Pharaoh. Joseph has the plan how to save the country. They won't perish in the famine. But here's the interesting point about Joseph working for Pharaoh and working for the people. And one I think that has something to think about in terms of work in general. And that is, Joseph saves the people, and they're very happy with it. But at the end of the day, what's curious about the Joseph story, it's actually this week's Torah reading. is that Pharaoh is very anxious for Joseph to work. Pharaoh has a whole thing. You work for me, you'll be the top guy in the country except for me, you'll have your own chariot. And he gives them a wife, marries Joseph into the priestly family of Egypt, and he changes Joseph's name, and he has special clothing. He gives him his ring, hands him the ring. Now, he's very interested in Joseph taking the job. Now, what is Joseph's choice over here? Pharaoh offers him this unbelievable job. Joseph could say no. Joseph could say, I can't really work for you, Pharaoh. I don't really want to marry the daughter of the Egyptian priest. I don't want my name to be Tzavnat Paneach. And my name is Joe. Right? You give me a different name, but my name is Joe. It's not some Egyptian name. I'm not Luke. I'm Joe. He could have said that. And then Pharaoh would say, you don't want to work for me? Okay, fine, don't work for me. Where are you coming from again? Jail? Go back to the jail. And you'll be there till the day you die. So that's Joseph. Does Joseph have a choice? Not much of a choice. He's at the end of the day still a slave. He has no choice. You're working for Pharaoh. And the point is that you're working for Pharaoh who had bad dreams. What were the dreams Pharaoh has? One dream is that the sheaves devour the sheaves, and the other was that the cows devour the cows. In other words, one is a dream about cattle, and one is a dream about land. It's a story that follows the execution of his chief baker, the man in charge of the food. And Joseph understands dreams very well. He understands the person. What are the dreams of the Pharaoh? He wants to control the cattle. He wants to control the land. And Joseph says to him, listen, I have a way to give you everything. To enslave the people, that the earth will belong to Pharaoh. Vati aretz leparo. Chumash later on in Vayikra says, God says, Kili aretz, says God, it's my land. Right? You are strangers and sojourners with me, says God. The land is mine. But what Joseph has managed to do is maneuver everything into Pharaoh's hand. Vati aretz leparo. That's the job. Take it or leave it. Slavery or work for Pharaoh. When you work for Pharaoh, this is the understanding from day one. Pharaoh says it right in the beginning. People come for food. Go to Joseph and do what he tells you to do. What's he going to tell you to do? Money, cattle, and land. And by the way, why does the money run out after 1 year? Charge a lower price. It won't run out. They're charging a price that after 1 year, there'll be no more money. That's what Joseph does. On the other hand, he actually saves the nation. And the people say, you've kept us alive. So this question, I think about this all the time in terms of work. When you get beyond, people work, many because we have to work. For many people, and there's no choice, whatever job you can find, you take. But I think in Western society, most people I'm familiar with, they have choices. They don't have to work in this particular job necessarily. They can find other work. And then the question really becomes, what kind of work do we do? And for whom do we work? And what are the assumptions made about the place in which we work? And those are the questions that the Chumash actually deals with. And we get to Jacob, there are other questions about what kind of person we're working for in terms of mutual responsibility. That's another issue of work. But over here, it's an interesting question. Because on one hand, you're working for Paro. And there is a critique, I believe, of Joseph. He ends up enslaving the Egyptian people. And the next step is to enslave the Jewish people. That's just how it plays out. On the other hand, he can do a lot of good. On the other hand, he also has no choice. He is, at the end of the day, required to do it. So these are the kinds of questions I think that the Chumash thinks about. And I just wanted to repeat what I said at the beginning, and I'll stop and take comments and questions, which is the Chumash sees malacha not as a necessary evil. The Chumash, I think, sees malacha as something, it's God's work. And tomorrow we'll focus on the building of the temple, which is also called malacha. And there the Torah presents us with, I think, optimally what work could be. I'm not saying that we all can do everything we wish to do with the labor, and people make decisions for multiple reasons, including supporting ourselves and our families. That's obvious. But again, the issues here that the Chumash raises in terms of Joseph, who is a great worker, is an issue in terms of relationship to the people making decisions, the kind of work you do. Optimally, work is part of God's what God does. God creates a world, and we have a responsibility to sustain the world. What the Gemara calls Yishuv Shel Olam, to help build the world. And the world is built. We need many, many things. And people have different kinds of skills, as we'll see with the Mishkan. The different people have different skills. So the larger project of sustaining God's world and working in the world and improving the world, at the same time being able to meet our needs, that is, of course, there. But the question the Chumash is raising here, in the case of Joseph, is these kinds of questions. What is, in fact, the culture that we are part of? We're part of it. What have we accomplished in our work? And what messages do we send to ourselves and others, depending on the kind of work that we do? So I think the Joseph and Paro situation, Joseph working for Pharaoh, is highly instructive. Let me stop here and take comments or questions. If anybody has comments, questions, happy to hear it.
Not really much in chat, but you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask questions. Raise your hand or ask in chat if you're having some trouble. Michael?
Yeah, thank you, David. The model you've used, though, of Joseph, and you've raised it a bit, that Joseph working for Pharaoh, he's not just working for Pharaoh, he's working for Egypt, the leadership, etc. And is there a difference? And the types of moral questions he faces are very different moral questions. And these are real contemporary questions, obviously, as well. So do you play out between working for, a business where there may be some questionable things as well, and the loyalties have to play out, versus when you've become, can I use the word, co-opted by the government?
Right. No, I agree with you. That was the point I was pushing to that point. I think it's much more complicated. In the case of Joseph, he is working for the people, and the people say this straight out. And given this situation, the way it's set up, maybe that's the best he can do. Point is, they say, Hechi Yitanu, you've kept us alive. What I'm saying is that is certainly true, but I think the Torah, the way I read the Chumash is, when the Torah says Vatia Aretz LeParo, it doesn't strike me as a neutral statement. It strikes me that maybe it comes with the territory. These things are never black and white. There are always, that's what's interesting. It's always complicated. There are all kinds of positives, and there are also challenges that we have. And in the case of Joseph, I raise it dafka, as you say, because on one hand, he's working for the people, he's helping the people, he's saving not just the people, it's the whole world. There's a Kol Haaretz. His brothers are going to come from Canaan to get food. This is a guy who figured out how to, without food, you don't live. He's figured out how to, as he says, the land will not perish. This is the man who saved thousands, tens of thousands, maybe millions of lives at the same time. In order to do it, you have to please the powers that be. And this is, look, it's part of, one might say politics is the same way. Basically, it's the art of the possible. The politicians have to, in order to succeed in politics, you make all kinds of concessions. It just comes with the territory. The politicians are not prophets. The prophet just speaks the truth. The politician has to deal with the reality on the ground. I'm not criticizing it. I'm just putting the problem. I'm presenting it as a real issue, and I think we should be aware of it. And I think the real issue is that very often people think that workplaces don't have any kind of value system. They think that sort of secular society, like religious society, has values. You may like them or not like them, but secular society doesn't have values. That's not true. Secular society has many values, many. And I think if you go into it thinking there are no values there, the college campuses have values. I'm even talking about the latest iterations of anti-Semitism and that. They've always had values. And the question is, what are the values? And, you know, every institution has values. Schools often have values, often not what they say their values are, but schools have their own set of values, whatever they may be. And understanding what the values are and then dealing with it is really important. So your point is, I agree with you 10,000%. I think it's very complicated because he does a lot of good. He saves a lot of lives. But at the same time, there is that other piece over here. And I think that in terms of the workplace, that's what the Chumash cares about. And I think that for a lot of people, we take jobs, or they take jobs in situations where they discover after some time that they don't necessarily, that what the place represents, often part of a larger picture, you know, is that, you know, some places it's all about the bottom line. It's all about making money. It doesn't really matter how you do it. I mean, that's an extreme formulation of it, but I think there are all kinds of issues that come up at workplaces, and that everybody should go into work understanding that these issues are there, and one makes decisions. There are many reasons to make it, you decide based on the big picture, but I think the story of Joseph, it presents us in a very, very interesting way. That was my point, yeah.
When Yaakov sent him out, he became the first failed foreman, because he was saying that the brothers were fooling around, basically. And he was asked to look at them. He was like the foreman at what they were working at, and they failed.
I think that sending him out there under those
productive.
circumstances was very problematic in the sense of, because the brothers, because the Torah says about Joseph, the first thing you hear about Joseph is he brought back evil report to his father. And now Yaakov sends Joseph out again to bring back word of the brothers. So one could, I mean, his intentions were good, obviously. He wants to make peace, but sending him out in that circumstance, as one could see at, oh, here comes the spy. I mean, it's not clear the brothers know that he says bad things about them, but the Chumash puts it that way, that's what Joseph does. So, of course, it didn't succeed, but it was, I would say, more Yaakov's attempt to make peace, which doesn't work out. I think tomorrow we'll focus on, there are two other stories. One is Yaakov in the house of Lavan, which, of course, is all about work. And the other is the Mishkan. So I did want to see if we can touch upon those two. This is in general. I want to put the issues out on the table. So I think those are two stories which deal really with work. Yaakov in the house of love, and of course, and then building the Mishkan. What work could be, what work should be, this ideal of the Mishkan as a source for what work could be. So we'll stop here, I guess, at this point, and tomorrow we will continue. If anybody has any questions about this session, you can email me, dsilber@drisha.org. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Rabbi Silber. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I hope you are able to make it here tomorrow for the second of this two-part series. Thank you for joining us for all of our Winter's Mon offerings this week.